From Shine Cancer Support, this is
Not Your Grandma's Cancer Show.
This is not your grandma's cancer show.
Hi, I'm Tatum, and today we're diving into the emotion of numbers. When we get a diagnosis of cancer, our lives can become governed by statistics and maths. And I hadn't been in a math class since I was 15 years old, and there's sometimes this real pressure to see numbers as neutral. But when we've been diagnosed, stats can be filled with feelings. So today, I've got three great guests with me. Laragh was 24 when she was diagnosed, and she's sharing how she made decisions based on likelihoods. Ceinwen is Shine's co-founder and CEO, who felt that after she was diagnosed, the odds of good things happening should be ever in her favour. And Krishnan is a statistical epidemiologist who will be sharing what on earth that is. But he is someone who is an expert with stats and numbers, and he's going to share what we should look for in a study and which risks are the riskiest risks. So let's get going.
This is not your grandma's cancer show.
Not Your Grandma's Cancer Show with Tatum Durock.
So, Laragh, what was going on in your life when you were 24?
I'd had on and off health issues, which is the epic precursor to the story, really, isn't it? We wanted to move forward, my partner and I. We were planning a wedding, thinking about moving into a job, and really, really excited to get life going. So, yeah, just typical 24-year-old things, really, wasn't it?
Those health concerns, they'd brought you back to the doctor many times. So you had a lump in your neck. And what did the doctors say to you about that lump?
It's really, really weird how that all went on, because I think for at least 5 years prior, I was constantly at the GP, antibiotics for infections. It was absolutely crazy. And then next thing you know, I'm in A&E for something, and they do a CT scan, and they're like, oh, your thyroid looks a little bit weird. Let's have a look into that. And it's interesting because I thought this, which was back to those GP appointments. They always said my neck felt swollen, but they never, ever, ever looked into it. So they kept saying, oh, that's a little weird, but okay, bye. It's not going to be a problem. You're fine. And finding that lump was obviously quite alarming to us. But again, it was one of those, 20-year-olds, they get thyroid nodules all the time. They're usually benign. You're good. Bye.
And did you get a letter saying something like that?
Yeah, I initially, for whatever reason, saw a respiratory consultant about this, which was always a little bit weird to me, but I have a letter from him, and it's a bit bizarre because I can't actually find the digital copy, but it essentially stated that the likelihood of me having thyroid cancer was negligible. It just wasn't there. The risk wasn't there. It wasn't going to be cancer, and they were very hilariously confident in that.
That's so reassuring, right? If you get a letter like that, the chances of it being cancer are negligible. That's a really strong statement. And yet, the name of this podcast gives it away, of course. You were diagnosed.
Spoiler alert.
Yeah, exactly. And what was your reaction on the day that they finally told you what it was?
It took about a year to get to the diagnosis from them finding the lump. They did biopsies, they came back inconclusive, and they kept saying, okay, well, it's a bit big, so let's take it out, let's have a look at it. They had a look at it, and it was a bit strange because it was at the same time the postal strikes were happening. So I got a call from the hospital on Christmas saying, oh, we don't know if you knew this, but you had an appointment to come in at the end of January to see us to discuss your surgery and how it went. And that for me was the biggest red flag. And I think it was then I experienced the most emotion, that sort of unknowing, that uncertainty. That was so, so jarring for me because obviously I've been told it's not going to be cancer. It's going to be fine. You're good. So when they told me and they said, yeah, so it's a carcinoma, I think was the word they used, I laughed. My partner was there almost in tears and I was just laughing because it was just so weird to me and so almost kind of funny to me that it was cancer. They were wrong. They kept telling me to think positively, but unfortunately, positive thoughts don't cure cancer.
Oh, Laragh, I can really hear the build-up to that moment of being told that and being told what was the most unlikely thing. And almost in that moment of that laughter of like, are you kidding me with that? And then, so they've taken out half your thyroid on one side. And then there was a question that they posed to you about whether or not to take out the other side. And what information were you given? Were you told it's likely to be on the other side or unlikely?
I was essentially told that they were confident that they'd removed all the cancer in that first surgery. However, something they hadn't informed me about the first surgery was they'd also removed a lymph node. And that also tested positive, which felt kind of weird to me because I didn't know what happened in that surgery. The fact that they hadn't told me they were going to do that just felt kind of violating in a way. Like, it was like, oh, okay, you're just removing bits of me, cool. With the second surgery, I think I saw 3 different ear, nose and throat consultants in that time. And one of them, he was fantastic. He was great. He gave me lots of info. He didn't tell me what to think or what to feel about it. And he went on ahead with essentially assuming that the second surgery was going to go ahead. And it was like, okay, right, let's do some blood tests. Let's have a look at this. And we think that it's preventative. So yeah, you'll be all right. The second consultant I saw proceeded to say, you could walk away right now and you'll be fine without the second surgery.
Who wants to have an additional surgery, right? You've just been through one, you've just gotten this news, you kind of want to regroup. So you're left in a decision of either the really nice doctor kind of going, okay, this is what you do from the second one going forward, and the other one going, we're really confident we've got it all, the surgery's unnecessary. That's a really big choice that you had.
The thing I was told about the second surgery was if I had the rest of my thyroid out. Your thyroid's actually a very essential organ, and I don't think I ever knew how important it was, but I'd have to then be on a completely synthetic hormone, which meant I'd actually have a daily reminder of this for the rest of my life. And so making a choice to completely change the way my body operates and how my morning routine goes, it was very big. But at that point, I'd already started to have trust issues with medical professionals due to the whole, it's not cancer.
Yeah.
It doesn't set the bar very high.
Yeah. So you went ahead, had that surgery, and what was the result that came back?
It was very unclear what they were going to do. I bounced between 2 hospitals because they weren't sure who was going to be able to do what, and that was complicated enough as it was. But I kept hearing, you're going to be fine, it's purely preventative. And then the other half, and I think about 23 lymph nodes later, they come back to me and they go, that surgery wasn't quite as preventative as we thought it was. It turns out they were also affected.
So had you not had that surgery, had you not made that decision, you wouldn't have known there was still cancer there. So that's a huge amount of weight on you. And now you're faced with another treatment option, which is to have the radioactive iodine. How are you processing making this another decision?
I think so. Something that I've usually done in life is prepare for the worst and hope for the best. But the more and more I hoped for the best here, the more it'll let me down. And I think I definitely became quite cynical about all of this. I was aware of the fact that radiation has the capabilities to cause some quite serious damage to the body. And they kept telling me that this was preventative cleanup, essentially. It was to, in case there was like a stray cell that got away here and there, that, yeah, it'll be all right. You're fine. Nothing's going to come up. And at this point, I hadn't had a scan. So we didn't actually, you couldn't really confirm on a computer where it was. And I was told that, again, preventative, there's essentially the option there. And one thing I wasn't told was the long-term effects of it. They didn't seem to think it relevant to tell me about fertility problems, gut health. It affects all kinds of things. I was only informed of the immediate side effects. So your salivary glands might get a bit dry, which is just a bit like, okay, cool.
So in there's the decision whether or not to have it based on there's a stray cell, but then also, and this is the thing, the risks, the likelihoods of having those long-term side effects that what you're saying that can happen. And this is the thing, is like that's so much. There's so many things that you're weighing up. What was the result? What did they find after they did the radioactive iodine?
They do a scan immediately after they give you radioactive iodine. They use the iodine as a tracer. And they scanned me 3 days after giving me the radioactive iodine. That was the 6th of September that happened. And I was called back in December. So December 2023. That in itself was a very, very strange appointment. But I was told that my lungs kind of lit up like a metastasis-riddled Christmas tree. It was a bit weird, that. And again, it plays into these trust issues and the fact that had I not made the choice to have the radioactive iodine treatment, we might not have had that scan. Those cells might not have been hit by radiation.
So at every stage, you were sort of being reassured, really, you know, it's unlikely to be cancer, it's unlikely to be on the other side, it's unlikely to be anywhere else. And you've had to continue forward making those decisions based on likelihoods, but then you fall into this tiny category. Those things did happen to you. So if there is another decision now going forward and a new, you know, kind of stats on something, how would you feel about making a decision?
I used to be a very logical person, look at the numbers kind of person, like, oh yeah, nah, this will be fine. But now I look at the statistics and I think, so long as there's a statistic there, whether it's like a tiny, tiny percentage, there is nothing stopping it from happening to me. I can't stop it. My medical team can't stop it, no matter how much they try with their positive thinking. Obviously, making decisions that didn't seem like the right ones at the time ended up being the right ones. I think I'd probably keep choosing treatment.
And I think that's the thing, is there is like you were saying, I used to be sort of a really logic person, but like now there's a whole other filter that you're looking at the situation because of the experiences that you've been in. I think that's, you know, what you've perfectly articulated, is that we don't come to this like as a blank slate. Time and time again, those tiny numbers are relevant. Yeah, thank you so much, Laragh, for sharing that with us. Ceinwen, how has it been for you hearing about Laragh?
Yeah, I just think it throws up, you know, how we live with uncertainty and how difficult it can be to make those decisions, especially when you're younger and you don't think that you're going to get cancer. You know, I think it's one thing to hear those stats about, 1 in 2 people will get cancer in their lifetime, but usually you think it's 1 in 2 90-year-olds,
right?
Not 1 in, you know, it just shows how tough it is, really. You never think it's going to happen to you.
And Ceinwen, when you were being treated, how did you feel when the doctor said that your case was unusual?
Well, one thing I think I've learned through all of my kind of medical treatment is you never want to be the unusual case. You want to be like really the bog standard patient. They're like, we've seen this a million times, we can fix you. And I think I got to the point, because I had so many parts of my experience where they said, oh, you know, this is really unusual. Well, this is a really unusual case. And I just remember thinking, God, I don't want to be unusual. I just want you to tell me you've seen this before and you can fix it. So it's really hard. And I think younger people get that more because, like Laragh said, you know, they don't think that, doctors especially often don't think it's going to happen to someone who's younger. So you are unusual by virtue of the fact you've got cancer and you're under 50.
That's the thing, is you sort of, by getting that diagnosis, you become that statistic. I mean, of course, we're not statistics, we're us, but it is kind of this meeting of the impact of that and also numbers coming into our life. When you were in hospital, can you tell me a little bit about what you started buying?
So I was diagnosed with stage 4 non-Hodgkin lymphoma, which I developed when I was pregnant. So I ended up having this premature baby and then really advanced blood cancer and being told I had to stay in the hospital for 6 months and just thinking I was the most unlucky person in the world. You know, who does this happen to? I'd never known that you could be pregnant and have cancer at the same time. So I went through this phase. I mean, I had a lot of feelings, but one of my feelings on good days was like, okay, so maybe I'm due some good luck. So I started buying lottery tickets because I thought like, well, if I was so unlucky that I got cancer and pregnancy and cancer at the same time, surely the universe is going to give me some good luck. And I was in a hospital in Hampstead in Northwest London where I could never afford to live. So I was like, maybe now's my chance. I'm going to win the lottery and I can buy a house here. I never won the lottery. I still have never won the lottery. I've won like 12 pounds in the lottery. That's the maximum I've ever won. But it was a nice thought.
There ends up being a little bit of magical thinking that happens around kind of odds and statistics and numbers. And what are the odds of being pregnant and having cancer and everything that you went through at that time? It's like the universe should really, provide some kind of yin and yang to this situation.
Yeah. I feel like Krishnan will tell us why that's not true. It should be true. It should be true.
It really should. Do you think, though, that how we look at numbers is also a bit about how we handle risk in general? Like, I know Laragh was saying kind of like, I used to be this really logical person, but like a little bit of who we are before and who we are after cancer. Are we someone that throws the dice, puts in for the lottery tickets? Would you have considered yourself a bit of a sort of gambler at life?
Every time I've ever been to a casino, which is not very often, I lose all my money in 10 minutes. So I don't go in with very much because I feel like, the odds in that way aren't in my favor. But up until the point that I got sick, I don't know if I'd considered myself a lucky person, but I felt like the world was a good place to a large extent. And I used to work in international development, and I worked with a lot of people that really bad things had happened to. So it wasn't like I knew that bad things couldn't happen to good people. It was just that I thought, well, things that bad won't happen to me. And things that bad haven't happened to me. I mean, bad things have happened, but, in perspective, maybe I was just a bit more of a hippie. Maybe I still am. I don't know. It's really hard to tell because, I was told I had a 40% chance of surviving for 2 years. And those numbers really played on my mind for a long time. I used to sit in the hospital and think, God, I just wish it was like 51% that was in my favor. I felt like 40% was really too low. And I had horrible thoughts. I would look around waiting rooms and think, right, okay, if there's 10 of us sitting here, 6 of us are going to die, and think, well, I really want to be, one of the 4 that survive. But then you feel awful because you don't want those other 6 people to die either. It's a really tough thing. Those numbers really played around in my mind. And I used to, my husband is an epidemiologist as well. And I used to call him from the hospital and say, like, you got to tell me why these numbers don't apply to me, and he would sort of walk me through like, okay, you're younger than the average, the studies are out of date, all of these things. But ultimately, it's really tough, right? Because your chance of survival, ultimately, I don't know, actually, Krishnan is going to correct me, but I feel like, it's either 0 or 100%, like 40% of you doesn't survive, right? And then that's really difficult. It blows my mind. I don't know how you apply them. Ultimately, I think you just have to, I guess a bit like Laragh said, you want to hope for the best, prepare for the worst, hope for the best, and just keep going and enjoy every day. And that's hard when you've got those numbers hanging over you.
Yeah, and they can really play on your mind. And people will sometimes on the outside try and go, oh, well, and they'll try and kind of juggle the numbers in front of you, like kind of rearrange them. And what I felt was going, but if you had that chance, putting it in the positive, of becoming a billionaire, right, you would be having a list. You know what I mean? You'd be like, but somehow when it's a negative thing, that we're almost like not allowed to look at it. But actually, like you said, it can just hang there, kind of just lurking. And I know for me, when I was in an MRI machine and I was thinking, okay, I had breast cancer, that means my mum and my sister are going to be okay, because 1 in 3, right? Like, what are the odds? And within 4 months, my mum had ovarian cancer, and I was like, no, that wasn't the way it was supposed to go. Like that, I had arranged the numbers in my head in such a way to kind of magically protect the rest of my family. And I was happy that it was me. I was like, yes, I can take this. I can sustain this. And, but that isn't the way it works. So...
No, and, not that long ago, I think I was having a glass of wine and someone said, oh, alcohol can cause cancer. And I was like, it's okay, I've already had cancer. I'll be fine. Again, I know it doesn't work like that. But sometimes you just think, I need a break from the numbers.
Yes, absolutely. The numbers on your life, there's the numbers on every time, like Laragh, like with every treatment option, that weighing up of the long-term effects. And like for me, there was a question about, removing my ovaries. And it massively reduced my cancer risk, like something ridiculous. Numbers are not my forte, I'll admit. But it was something like 140% reduction in getting cancer. But it increased my non-cancer related death by 170%. So I was like, oh, okay. But those things were longer term. So it's again sort of pushing that down the road. So there's the immediate risks, the longer term risks. Krishnan, I'm going to bring you into the conversation here. First of all, can you tell me, what is a statistical epidemiologist? What is it that you do?
I came from a background of studying mathematics and statistics, so it's very much a numbers person. And my job as a statistical epidemiologist is to kind of apply those skills to working with health data. And what we look at as epidemiologists is basically everything to do with diseases in populations. So it might be looking at how common things are, what sort of people get different diseases, how people do from those diseases, to what extent they get good outcomes, bad outcomes, how different treatments affect diseases. So it's trying to answer all of these kind of relevant questions, but kind of, in my case, using the numbers and the statistics as a tool to do that.
And what is the thing you love most about your job?
I think I'm really lucky to be in a job that sort of married my numbers bent and my statistical sort of background with a sort of natural interest in medicine and kind of wanting to do something that would help people. The things I've enjoyed about it have definitely changed over time. I think when I was started out, it was kind of the excitement of discovering things, and you were doing data analysis yourself and making being the first one to see a pattern, and that's really exciting. And then my partner was diagnosed with cancer, so then I had a real insight into the sorts of things you've been talking about, and that really brought home how you could have an impact and actually answer really important questions that the doctors just don't know the answer to. So I think that became something really fulfilling.
So did your wife contact you the way Ceinwen called her husband?
Yeah, that was all very familiar, what Ceinwen was saying. And again, she was in her 20s at the time. The statistics we were seeing at the time, I think, were really quite out of date because there was new developments in treatment that had come out in the last 5 years that had made a big difference. And so you sort of saw the survival statistics from older studies that didn't include this, and they were quite scary. Similar sorts of numbers to, I think, what Ceinwen heard. But actually, with the new treatments, those odds were much better. The statistics hadn't really caught up. So, I remember sort of similarly having those conversations, trying to say, that you're not as high risk as the sort of raw numbers might suggest.
And was there ever a time that you and your wife looked at the same set of numbers and had very different reactions or thoughts or feelings about them?
I think we've got sort of similar attitude to risks. So, maybe a sort of safety first kind of attitude to risk, and it comes across whether we're looking at, whether to fix our gas bills or back when it was thinking about treatment options. But for me, the big change was coming from just the perspective of a researcher, where you're just looking kind of always at what's happening on average in the population, to then seeing these kind of questions in a clinic with one patient that you care about and having to process that. And then it's like, actually, you don't really care if 80% of people have a good outcome and 20% have a bad, because exactly as Ceinwen said, you're one person and it's going to be good or bad. It's not going to be 80% of good. So I think getting my head around that was, for me, was a bit of a change, having prior to that only really sort of looked at it at the population level, where it's kind of easier at the population level because you just need to optimize what happens on average, right? But when it's one person, you suddenly don't care about the average. You care about the outcome for that one person.
Absolutely. Yeah. So if somebody is like me, kind of plunged into statistics and numbers with a brain that doesn't really work for them when it comes to that, I'd love to ask you some questions of sort of where to begin. And of course, all the terminology. Let's start with risk, because there is relative risk, absolute risk, increased risk, elevated risk. Can you tell me, like, which is the risk that we really need to be looking for when we're looking at a study or an article?
Relative risks is when you hear something like, oh, such and such doubles your risk, or this treatment will halve your risk, right? So the importance of that depends on what the sort of underlying risk is in the first place, right? Imagine that there's a really, really rare heart condition and it only affects 1 in a million people. Okay, and someone says, oh, drinking coffee will double your risk of this heart condition, which sounds alarming. And this is the sort of thing that newspapers often will quote, because or you'll hear on the radio, because they're quite sort of striking, and people sort of suddenly sit up and listen. But a doubling of a risk that was only 1 in a million in the first place is probably nothing to worry about. It means, okay, you drink your coffee, you're going to have a 2 in a million risk of getting this rare heart condition, and most people wouldn't be too worried about that. So that's the absolute increase in risk, is from 1 in a million to 2 in a million. So it's just a 1 in a million additional risk from drinking the coffee, but it's actually, in relative terms, it's a doubling of risk, which sounds terrifying.
Absolutely.
So being able to sort of understand, if there was only one thing to take away, I'd say it's actually sort of being aware of the different interpretation of those statistics, and the fact that often in the media you do hear relative risks, and so you hear things expressed as doublings of risk, or sometimes it's actually not very clear what they mean when they speak on the radio or put it in a newspaper, because they might say the risk was increased by 20%. Now, you don't know if that's, usually that means on the relative scale, okay, but it's a bit ambiguous, because obviously a 20% absolute increase in risk is quite large, but usually they mean relative. So trying to process that, I think, is quite hard for people who are not sort of schooled in statistics and probability.
Yeah, so if someone's listening to something like that, and actually thinking about Ceinwen's example about alcohol, I mean, I think a lot of us have delved into looking and reading studies, which are quite dense. They literally start with abstract. And you're like, okay, it'd be really nice if it was the opposite. Where are we? Let's ground ourselves here. Why are we, at the beginning going off on a tangent? Coming in as someone that not from that world. How do you know if a study is decent? And I mean, they're happening all the time. So like Ceinwen said, statistics can go out of date so quickly. So what do you look for? Is there a date right now that you'd go, studies pre this date I wouldn't go with? Would you try and keep to recent studies, or do you look at the size? What are your criteria to know if it's a study that's legit?
It really varies, I think, in terms of the timeliness, especially because it depends on what specific condition you're looking at as to whether things have really been fast changing or not, and whether there have been new treatments. So it's quite hard to sort of say what timescale is relevant. It depends if there's been much movement in that field. Working out whether a study is any good or not is quite a task, even for those of us that sort of do this professionally. I mean, one thing that you're looking for is, has it been peer reviewed? Because that's a bit of a shortcut. So if a study's been in a journal where they basically send it out to independent other epidemiologists or scientists to review and look at really closely at the methods, these are people who should understand these sorts of methods, then that can be a bit of a badge of better quality. But there's some really well-known journals that you can be pretty sure that they've been through a rigorous process. So things like the Lancet and the BMJ. But beyond that, if you're going into the actual methodology, it's hard. A big study doesn't guarantee that it's good quality. Sometimes you can have very large numbers of people in your study and still kind of do a bad job. In fact, it can be a bit more dangerous because you've got more sort of statistical power, as we call it, to find things. And if you haven't got the methods right, that can be misleading. One thing I would say is it's generally good advice not to be too influenced by any single study where they've just looked at a new data set and it's just a single piece of data, because you get really, the way science works is you get multiple studies on a particular topic and eventually you get to some consensus, and that tends to sort of balance out the good and the bad. And as time goes on a particular topic, you'll get reviews coming out, which then summarize both the studies that have been done on that particular question, and often they rate the quality of those studies. So those are quite good things to look for, those kind of review papers where they take in all of the evidence that's been published and they do a quality appraisal and they say, on balance, this is what, we think the answer to this question is.
What you've said is so reassuring, because I've definitely felt kind of really unqualified looking at studies and imagining that everyone else knows things about them that I don't. And the fact that you've said, actually, they're quite tricky. Just reading one isn't necessarily going to garner all the information that you would need. I think that's really useful. I can see Ceinwen nodding there. If you'd like to come in and share your thought there, Ceinwen.
Academic literature can be so impenetrable. It's really tricky. And obviously you put a search term into Google and it throws up 8 million results, and you have to be really careful about what you're looking at. It's really easy to go sometimes, I think, for the top stuff or the top search results that come up, but it can be kind of junk science. And I'm really lucky. My husband's in it. I've got like a pocket epidemiologist that I take with me. So I send him all my questions and say, is this a good study? But, I've read certain things and, maybe it's not a very good study. It only had 28 people in it and 3/4 of them died. And I sort of think, oh my God, is that going to be me? And then have to be talked down because actually, my husband will say, well, it wasn't a very good study and, all of these kinds of things. So I just think, like you said, Tatum, it's really tricky. But I think what Krishnan said is really interesting, actually. Can you find multiple studies that say the same thing? That's really useful information. If you can find a review paper that sort of looks at okay, there were 50 studies published on this topic. This is what they've said. That's a great tip.
Can you tell me what a meta-study is?
There's a term called a meta-analysis. Is that what you mean?
I think so.
It's related to this idea of these reviews that bring together all the studies on a particular question. And some of them, if they can find enough studies that have asked the question in a similar way, will do a meta-analysis. So basically they take all of the results, the sort of numerical results for that particular comparison. Let's say the question is should we use, radiotherapy in this particular type of cancer? And you might have a bunch of studies that have looked at that question, and each of them have produced some kind of, a relative risk or some measure of whether the radiotherapy helped or not. And what they'll do is basically take them all and produce a sort of average which is weighted according to the things like the size of the study, to say overall, amongst all of this, let's say 12 studies that looked at this question in a similar way, we can bring together all that evidence, and the summary statistic or the summary sort of relative risk was X. And that's a meta-analysis. Not all review studies do that, because often when you do a review, you find that the studies have all asked slightly different variations of the question. And so it's a bit misleading to just sort of lump all of the results together. But if they can find enough similar studies, they might well do that. And you might see that alongside a review in a paper.
Ceinwen?
So say you have breast cancer. I suppose there might be more studies that look at those kinds of questions for breast cancer than if you've got a really rare type of cancer. That's probably one of the problems. I'm just thinking in the SHINE community, That's one of the challenges that we face is we often get people with rarer cancers, and then it's even harder to find that information.
Yeah, it is. On the other hand, I mean, it is definitely hard. It's easier to do reviews in common cancers where there have been dozens of studies. On the other hand, those kinds of like reviews and meta-analysis type approach can be even more valuable when you've got rare studies, because then you find that each of the individual studies that have been done might only have a handful of people because it's a rare cancer, or it's something happening in young people that is uncommon. And so on their own, they really just don't have much power to be definitive. But if you can bring a lot of those small studies together that might have been done in different countries or different settings, and combine all of that statistical power, you might actually be able to get a definitive answer, more so than any individual study can do. So it's more difficult, but it can also be kind of really valuable in those rare cancers.
It's really good to hear that. And I think that's the thing, is when we're looking at statistics and studies and everything, is that it doesn't always take in our age. And, you know, kind of thinking, Laragh, when you were weighing things up, that it doesn't necessarily take in that you're 24 and like what might be going on for you is like really different if you were 44 or 64. And Laragh, was that something that you did, that you looked at some studies?
Oh boy, yeah. I think Dr. Google was my best friend at the time. So my partner and I, we felt like we were lacking in information because my team were quite patronizingly positive. It was very sort of like, okay, this is going to go well, you're fine, which obviously we didn't appreciate very much. So we'd go away and we found out that I think the likelihood was like 5% that it was cancerous, 20% that I'd need the second surgery medically. Such a tiny percentage for lung metastases. The one that drove us a little bit crazy recently, actually, was I had a checkup scan, I think a couple of weeks ago now. For the previous scan, I had to do a low iodine diet, which there's loads of studies about, and it's supposed to be really helpful for iodine tracer scans, helps your body uptake the iodine better by starving the cells of it. And then they changed the clinical advice for this scan and told me to not go on the low iodine diet. No further explanation. And so we both drove ourselves a bit mad looking at Google, and we haven't found anything on that and why the clinical advice has changed. So that's our most recent statistical, oh dear, where are we?
That's the thing. Things do change, don't they, Krishnan?
Yeah, I mean, that's the real challenge. And what you were saying earlier, Laragh, about those kind of decisions of short-term versus long-term, and very familiar from when my wife went through this, and trying to process that is quite difficult. We found at the time you're almost kind of surprised to be asked, because if you've never really had too much contact with the health services, but as young people often haven't, you just sort of assume they know what to do. Mm-hmm. And so, to find this situation where the doctor's saying, oh yeah, you know, we're not really sure whether you should have, in my wife's case, it was like having consolidative radiotherapy. You know, and again, you've got one doctor saying yes, one doctor saying, oh, I don't think you need it, and it might increase risks of things happening later, like having another cancer in 10 years. And trying to process that is very difficult. I think visualizations of probabilities are quite helpful. And Kane, when you sort of mentioned one really, where you imagine the 10 people in the waiting room and imagine that 4 of them are going to make it and 6 of them aren't. And I found that sort of thinking actually quite sort of helpful in weighing up these percentages. So you sort of imagine a room full of 100 people, and if you don't go for the radiotherapy, then X number are going to be fine anyway. So trying to sort of just, because I think the human mind is just not that good at processing a percentage number. And so you have to sort of try and turn it into some real bit of imagination that makes it sort of about people and situations. So yeah, some kind of risk communication tools that try to do that. I don't know if you've ever seen these grids of smiley faces. You know, sometimes you see them relating to heart disease risk. So if you go and have a heart disease risk assessment, as many people do, they have now predictors that will say, what's your percentage probability of having a heart attack or stroke in the next 10 years? So say it's 7%. And you can sort of know, some of the tools online will put this onto a grid. So you see 7 sort of sad faces and 93 smiley faces, and that's representing what that percentage risk means. And then it's sort of like, how many of the sad faces will turn smiley if you then give them a statin, which reduces their risk? So that kind of thing it's a similar idea. It's just trying to sort of produce something a bit more understandable that you can visualize from these abstract probability numbers.
I really like that, because not long after I was diagnosed, I wrote a piece basically about how stats were sort of, I'm really sorry to say this in front of you, sort of sleazy maths. Like, I just imagined it's the sleazy guy that rolls up to you at 2:00 in the morning and is like, hey, there's a 53% chance that I think you're gorgeous. And
can I just say, our medical statistics department is just full of nerds. It's really not that kind of vibe.
Actually thinking about what risks are and put it in, and like thinking about where you are with numbers. Everyone's different. Our visualization's good, kind of thinking about that room, or okay, so if we're going from 1 in 100 to 2 in 100, okay, like what does that actually look like? A little bit to summarize. If we're having emotions when it comes to numbers, it's really understandable because of we're already outliers. The statistic has already called our number, and it's really tough to look at this neutrally. But if we are going online and we are reading studies, we want to find more than one kind of saying the same thing. We want to look at ones that are peer-reviewed, ones that are in the Lancet and the BMJ. Was there another one, Krishnan?
There's too many to mention, really. But yeah, in terms of journal names, I mean, those are two of the biggest ones, but there are others, both in this country and international journals. So there's lots of good journals. I don't think I could name them all. But the trouble is there are thousands of journals overall. And so it's quite hard, unless it's one you've heard of that's really one of the really famous ones, to make too much out of it from just the journal title.
Okay.
So, yeah.
So kind of keeping an eye on the journals that, things are being reported in.
I mean, something I could add is also if you can get any information on who the researchers were, because if you sort of see that, if you're Googling and doing a bit of research for yourself, and you see the studies come out, have a look at the authors, who are the senior authors on that? Have they published a lot in this area? Are they seen as experts? If you've got people who are real experts in the area and doing lots of good science, they'll have lots of good papers out on the same sort of topic. So that's another way you can look at it. And of course, the institution, is it coming from a sort of an institution, is kind of respectable.
I've never looked at the author before, so that's a great tip. Thank you.
And I mean, scientific authors, certainly in universities, most of them have profiles and stuff online now that you can have a little look as to, like, okay, what is this person's actual expertise, and are they doing a lot of research in this field?
Thank you so much, Krishnan. Like, I know there's so much dodgy information out there, and it's really nice to kind of have a sense of, what we're looking for, where we might find it, what are the next levels if we are, like Lara was saying, like gonna do a deep dive, looking at the author, looking at the journal, what else are they publishing, what else are they doing? Really, really great information. Thank you to my guests, Laragh, Ceinwen and Krishnan, as well as to all of you listening. Head over to shinecancersupport.org to find the Shine community, find other people that are also, wrestling with numbers, other people who just get it. Thank you to the ever awesome radio facilities for recording us. Until next time, bye!
Bye!
This is not your grandma's cancer show.
Not your grandma's cancer show.